Dr. Sabrina Siegel with the Neuroscience Education Institute, and twice a month, I sit down with a renowned mental health care expert to discuss breakthroughs and best practices for treating patients with mental illness. In this episode of the NEI Podcast, we are discussing the science and the research behind sleep. We're talking about neuroscience research, and I have the privilege of interviewing Dr. Jade Wu today. Dr. Wu is a sleep researcher and a clinical psychologist at Duke University School of Medicine. She is also the host of the award-winning podcast, The Savvy Psychologist. Welcome, Dr. Wu.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Wu, my first question for you is, we know that sleep is so important to our daily function, and yet there's still so much unknown. What could you share with us about the reason that you became interested in researching sleep?
Well, the seed was actually sown very early on in my life because my father was actually a sleep researcher in China, and he actually worked with Chinese astronauts about, looking at how sleep might be affected by spaceflight. So from a very young age, from when I was like 4 or 5 years old, I was exposed to sleep as a science, and I thought that was really cool. And I just knew that looking at my father's textbooks, they were so big. I thought that was so awesome, and I wanted to be a sleep scientist too. And eventually, when I became a clinical psychology grad student, I actually started researching anxiety and mood disorders. And the more I looked into anxiety and mood disorders and other psychological disorders and physical illnesses, the more I realized that sleep is really sort of a common denominator across all of the things that can go well or not well with our minds and bodies. And I just became really fascinated by this thing that if only we could understand it better, if only we could get people to sleep better, maybe we can raise the water for all boats. So that's how I got into sleep research.
Wow, I love that. How do we know how much sleep we actually need? You'll hear things sometimes about people who say, well, I don't need that much sleep, and they're getting like 4 to 5 hours a night. No problem, functioning just fine. And then there's other people who can sleep 9 or 10 hours even and feel exhausted, like they haven't gotten enough sleep. So how do we actually know how much sleep we really need?
Yes, this is such a good question. And this question is deceptively simple because we're always looking for one answer. Like, oh, is it 8 hours? Is it 7 hours? And there's no straight answer that I could give you, unfortunately. But let me give you a longer, more nuanced answer. And hopefully this is at least a little bit helpful. So most healthy adults need about 7 to 9 hours of sleep. But different people are different. Some people need more, some people need less. And for adults who are under the age of about 65-ish, the appropriate number of hours of sleep per night on average could be as high as 10 hours, could be as low as 6 hours. And then there are always really rare cases of people needing even more or even less than that. So often people will say, well, I want to be a really good sleeper. I want to sleep those 9 hours at the top of that bracket for my age range. But that's not really how it works because your sleep is your sleep. And being a 9-hour sleeper doesn't necessarily mean you're better than someone who's a 7-hour sleeper. It's really about how much your body needs. It's kind of like saying, well, how much water should you drink? Yes, there's probably a range of what's appropriate, but if you're an elite athlete, for example, you probably need to drink more water than someone who's a couch potato. And it depends on your age too, right? Someone who's 35 probably needs more water than someone who's 5. And so with sleep is similar. It depends on your age, your lifestyle, how your body is wired, and we are all wired just a little bit differently. And
Mhm.
potentially there could be an evolutionary reason for this, because if you think about it, if the whole tribe went to sleep at exactly the same time and woke up at exactly the same time, then they're all very vulnerable at exactly the very same time for a stretch of number of hours, right? So
Right.
it's much better to have some of the tribe be restless at night, be night owls, and maybe some of the
Right.
tribe be really early morning birds. And then,
Wow.
somebody is up keeping watch while the rest of the tribe sleeps for most of the time. So it's okay for us to have diverse sleep needs. And it's okay for our own needs to be different than other people's, and also for our needs to change over time, depending on the week, the season, the year,
Mhm.
our age. So it's really actually difficult to say how much sleep we actually need. And really, the only way to know is to listen to your own body and see,
Mhm.
do you feel like you need more sleep? Are you sleepy during the day? Are you falling asleep really quickly when your head hits the pillow? That probably means you could use a little bit more. Yeah. Whereas if you're consistently, regularly tossing and turning, having trouble falling asleep, having trouble staying asleep, and you're trying really hard to go to bed early or sleep in late, but you just can't, then you may be trying too hard and you may be trying to
Mhm.
sleep too much. Or rather, let me
Right.
say, you may be trying to sleep more than you need to.
Right. Right. Wow. That is so interesting. I've never heard it explained that way, so that's fascinating.
Great.
Can you explain what current research tells us about the function of the various stages of sleep?
Yeah, so the different stages of sleep are really fascinating. And first, I should say that the stages of sleep, or rather, they're more accurately called the types of sleep, are not so cleanly delineated from each other. It's not
Mm.
as if we are in completely blocked off chunks of time where we're
Hmm.
completely in REM, which is rapid eye movement sleep, or completely in deep sleep, or completely awake and it's just black or white. It's not quite like that. Our brains are sort of moving in and out of different states all of the time.
Right.
And
Okay.
the best way that we can sort of capture the different states of sleep are these following types. So wakefulness is actually a part of sleep. We actually wake up many times during the night, even though we usually don't remember. And so the night is punctured by many brief awakenings. And then we have what is called light sleep or non-REM stage 1 and stage 2. I think this is a little bit of a misnomer because light sleep makes you think like your sleep is not working very hard, or you're not
Yeah.
really asleep, you're in the twilight zone.
Yeah.
And that's not really the case. I mean, with stage 1 sleep, that's a little bit twilight zoney, and some people some people don't even feel like they're asleep when they're in stage 1, and
Right.
really more of a quiet wakefulness resting state, but that really only takes up about 5% of the night. But stage
Okay.
2, which is also considered light sleep, that's actually legitimate, real sleep. And during this stage,
Mm.
our brains are doing some important things. This is one of the first stages that emerges in infants, by the way. Sleep spindles
Oh.
are these little rapid
Oh.
little fire bursts of brain activity that happens during stage 2 sleep. And that's what babies do a lot of. And part of that is probably because stage 2 sleep and sleep spindles are very important for consolidating procedural memory. And this means that when we learn how to do something using our hands, using our bodies, basically learning some sort of new motor function, we need stage 2 sleep to rehearse that and to store that into long-term memory. So if you're someone
Wow.
who's an athlete or just a regular person learning to ride a bike, to type, to serve a tennis ball, to play a video game, whatever it is that you're learning to do with your body, stage 2 sleep is helping you with that. And
Wow. That's
yeah,
fascinating.
yeah, so light sleep is not like half-baked sleep, it's real sleep. And deep sleep, this is something that has become extra popular in recent years since research has come out showing that during this stage, our brains are doing important janitorial work. It's basically cleaning out toxins from the
Mhm.
cerebral spinal fluid that it's keeping our brains healthy. And the lack of this type of function during deep sleep built up over time can increase someone's risk for dementia. So deep sleep
Ah.
is important. But, oh, I
Mhm.
forgot to mention, light sleep is supposed to take up about half of the night. So that's a lot more than
Oh,
most people
okay.
think. Whereas deep
Okay.
sleep, what percentage of the night would you guess that deep sleep is supposed to take up?
I off the top of my head, I would say about 15%, but I think I'm cheating because I have a Fitbit that tells me that, but I don't know if that's accurate.
That's great. You're actually right on target. Many people, many of my patients come in saying that they want 100% deep sleep, and
Right,
not
right.
feasible and also not necessary. You only need about 10 to 15% of your night
Okay.
to be deep sleep
Okay.
for your brain to do its job that it needs to do during deep sleep. So your Fitbit might actually be telling you accurately, or maybe not, who
Okay.
knows,
Okay.
that you're getting the right amount of deep sleep. So that's great. And last but not least, REM sleep. So this is rapid eye movement sleep. This is a really fascinating state for us to be in because our brains are actually quite active. Our EEG activity actually looks a little bit like when we're awake. It's very active, rapid fire activity, and our heart rates and our breathing and our bodily functions are more akin to when we're awake than when we're in light or deep sleep. And during REM is when most of our dreaming happens. And this is where we also do some important functions like more memory consolidation, a lot of emotional processing. And we know that REM has some interesting characteristics, like for people who have depression, if you actually deprive someone of REM sleep, there's actually a temporary antidepressant effect. And a lot of
Ah,
antidepressant medications actually suppress REM. And for
wow.
people who, yeah, this is really interesting because you would think the more REM, the better, but
Uh-huh.
sometimes that may not be the case. And
Okay.
in fact, for many people who have depression, they experience early morning awakening. And that's because most of our REM chunks during the night are happening later in the sleep window. So in the early morning hours. And so the idea is that maybe for people who are depressed, the brain is purposely cutting off those last couple chunks of REM in order to have that antidepressant effect. So the brain is
Ah,
regulating itself, regulating the states of sleep that it's doing during the night in order to give us what we need. And we see that auto adjustment with deep sleep as well, like depending on our age, depending on what we did during the day, how much physical activity we had, whether we are sick and need to be healing, the brain will auto adjust the amount of deep sleep and REM sleep and other types of sleep that we get in order to give our body what we need. And then when we're waking too, there are little intrusions of sleep in our waking experience, sometimes even
mhm.
without realizing, little parts of our brain could be having little bursts of deep sleep activity or deep sleep like activity. And we're not
Wow.
really sure if that's exactly parts of our brain doing deep sleep the way that dolphins or alligators or birds sometimes do. But I just think that's really cool and I wanted to share
Oh
that,
my gosh, that's amazing.
right?
That's incredible. Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. And
Sure.
since I mentioned my Fitbit, that actually turns me to my next question because I've become obsessed with the very first thing I do in the morning is I check my sleep on my Fitbit app. And I am just curious, what are your thoughts on how accurate devices like the Fitbit can be at tracking sleep? And they claim that according to your heart rate, you're in a specific stage of sleep. How accurate is that? And how much should we just take that as a grain of salt or put our faith into it?
That's such an excellent question again. And this is something that I could talk about for an hour just in and of itself. I'll try to be concise here. So the short story is devices like Fitbit and other consumer sleep tracking wearables
Uh-huh.
are getting better at telling when we're awake versus asleep. And they're getting
Okay.
better at telling when we're in bed versus not in bed. But they're not that good at telling what stage of sleep we're in yet.
Mm.
And when I was preparing for this interview, I actually did a quick lit search to see the most recent research on this topic. And one paper, I think, put it really well. The title was like, "This is your wrist, not your brain." And it's true, you wear a tracker on your wrist, and that is not your brain. So there's limited information that we can tell from movement and heart rate and even temperature about what stage of sleep we're in. So the short story is these trackers are not yet very good at telling sleep stages. And another thing I just want to throw in is you mentioned being really interested and really maybe even obsessed was your word, I think, um,
Yeah.
with tracking your sleep using these wearable devices. And I think that's a really interesting phenomenon that's come up in recent years. Now that we have these devices at our fingertips, literally, and we have
Mhm.
potentially our sleep data at our fingertips, it's really tempting to go all in on it. And I've heard of people and I've had patients who track their sleep using a spreadsheet or using these devices, and they download their data and they obsessively track over the course of weeks and months, looking for patterns, looking for ways of hacking their sleep. And I think this is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, I think there's really great potential for us to learn more about our sleep using these devices. And because
Mhm.
these devices are a lot more affordable than these gold standard polysomnography setups that potentially have to pay thousands of dollars to do in a sleep lab, I think that is a real pro of having these democratized devices. The con is that we get so obsessed with our sleep data that we learn to rely on what our devices tell us instead of listening to our bodies. And I think
Mm.
listening to our bodies is really important because, again, we need different types and different amounts of sleep depending on what we're doing, depending on our age, depending on a lot of factors. And your device doesn't know all of those factors. And actually, the research does show that depending on your age, and maybe even gender, and whether or not you have insomnia, and whether or not you have health conditions, and your lifestyle, your sleep hygiene practices, depending on all of these things, your device actually could be more or less accurate at scoring your sleep.
Ah,
And
okay.
so you don't know if you're one of those people where the device is really accurate or you're one of those people where the device is not at all, because the
Mhm.
range of accuracy is wildly huge.
Okay.
So I think
Okay.
listening to our bodies, which actually know
Yeah.
how to auto adjust depending on all of these factors better than
Right.
your device does, is a good idea at the end of
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think as a side note on that, and I mean, I would say that's sort of what I've noticed is that there's been, if I happen to get 7 to 8 hours of sleep and I look at the Fitbit and it's telling me I got good quality sleep, I usually feel like that's in sync physically. That's how I feel. But there's been times when I look at it and it's saying, "Oh, you got great sleep." And I'm like, "Oh, I do not feel like that at all."
Mhm.
Or the opposite where it's saying like, "I didn't get great sleep, but I feel like $1,000,000."
Yeah.
So I love that you mentioned that because at least until the technology is more developed, and whether it is or not, we should always be checking in with ourselves, right? And just sort of seeing where we're at in terms of how much sleep we need, how we feel, and adjusting that according to lifestyle, right?
Yes, absolutely.
A little bit to talking about insomnia, because I know you have a lot of research that focuses on this. What would you say is the most common reason for people struggling to fall asleep at night or waking up in the middle of the night and not being able to fall back asleep? Because I know a lot of people can relate to this.
Absolutely. So many people can relate. And this would depend on what stage of insomnia one is in. And here's what I mean. So when someone has just been struggling for the past couple of nights, like it's really a blip on the radar of generally good sleep, and they just happen to have a big interview coming up, or they are not feeling well because they have a cold and their nose is stuffed, these reasons could cause someone to struggle to fall asleep or wake up during the night. But these are not of great concern because once your nose clears or once that interview's over, you'll probably get back to baseline. But it's when over the course of weeks or months, that bad sleep is becoming the norm, that we need to start worrying a little bit more. Or worrying maybe is not the right word, but rather to start paying attention and to see what we
Hmm.
can do about the problem. Because acute insomnia happens to everybody. We all go through stressors or changes that
Yeah.
disrupt our sleep, and most of us, for the most part, get back to baseline after the stressor is removed. However, sometimes the insomnia takes on a life of its own and it becomes chronic. So that means even after the stressor is removed or our lifestyles go back to normal, whatever it may be, we the insomnia continues and maybe even worsens over time. And that's actually the most common type of patient I see in the clinic, is someone who's struggled with insomnia for many months, if not many years. And it's interesting because there are almost as many reasons for why they got insomnia in the first place as there are people who have insomnia. But the reason for why insomnia becomes chronic is pretty universal across many people, or at least I would say across mostly middle class or more affluent, privileged people in the Western world. So let me let me throw in that caveat,
Uh-huh.
because most of our insomnia research has been done in this population. So
Okay.
these reasons for insomnia becoming chronic are the ways that we act around sleep and the way we think about sleep. So often things that we do to try to solve our sleep problems can backfire and
Ah,
paradoxically make insomnia worse. So for example,
right.
sometimes we have a few bad nights of sleep and we're really frustrated with it. And so we want to go to bed early tonight to make up for it. Usually
Mhm.
that's okay. But sometimes when our sleep is getting really out of sync and we really try really hard to catch up on sleep by going to bed early or sleeping in late or taking naps, that starts to interfere with the consolidation of our nighttime sleep. So it's like eating big snacks before dinner. We're ruining our appetite for dinner. That's what happens when we sleep in or take big naps. We're ruining our appetite for nighttime sleep. And if we consistently do that, then we end up in this vicious cycle of the more we nap or sleep in, the more we can't sleep at night. And the more we can't sleep at night, the more tired and cranky and frustrated we feel. And the more we try to solve our sleep problem by going to bed even more. And then before you know it, we're spending 10, 11 hours in bed trying to sleep. And that's making things worse over time.
Ah, it's so interesting. Basically, touching on a few of the things that you just shared with us, when it comes to sleep, we hear a lot about what's called sleep hygiene. And could you explain to us why this actually is not recommended for insomnia and what is recommended instead?
So sleep hygiene is like dental hygiene. It's great for general practice. It may help prevent bad problems from happening. But once you already have a cavity, flossing is not going to cure that cavity. Just like once you already have insomnia, sleep hygiene is not going to cure that insomnia. And in fact, sleep hygiene is what we use as the placebo condition in our randomized control trials for insomnia treatment.
Wow.
So we expect it to be about as effective as a sugar pill. So what instead works well is something called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And this is actually the first line recommended treatment by the American College of Physicians and American Academy of Sleep Medicine. So basically people who know what they're talking about recommend cognitive behavioral therapy, which is CBTI for short, for insomnia. And we know from many research studies that this therapy is brief, it's cost effective, it's effective for improving sleep and helping someone overcome insomnia. And not only does it work in the short term, it works pretty quickly within a matter of weeks. It also lasts in the long term. In fact, we know from research that sleep actually continues to improve after CBTI is done, so that at 6-month follow up, 12-month follow up, people may actually be sleeping more and maybe even feeling better about their sleep than they felt at the end of treatment, at which point they already felt better than before treatment.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. This episode has been brought to you by the NEI Prescribe app. The most powerful tool for your prescribing arsenal is here. Based on the best-selling prescriber's guide, NEI Prescribe app gives you access to full prescribing details, including expert tips and pearls, more than 140 psychiatric drugs, and with the unique filter feature, you can identify treatment concerns specific to each patient in order to generate a customized list of possible medications to review. With full prescribing details for more than 140 psychiatric drugs, the NEI Prescribe app could help you in your practice. Go to www.neiglobal.com.